And here's how I want to go through the material today. Today, we're talking a little bit about the historical, political context, and we're talking a little bit about, you know, what we might call late modernité, the experiences and the values and opinions of people. At the beginning of this period of the 1950s, we're going to call this period the square 1950s. This is the dominant culture, the mainstream culture. The artists, the poets that we're going to look at, Kaufman and Ferlinghetti, belong to what we might call the other 1950s. Okay? And so what I want you to see in this poetry to begin with is a kind of battleground, a kind of fight and contesting for the high moral ground of whose attitudes and political positions are better, and there's a kind of a debate going on. And let's start with Lawrence Ferlinghetti's A Coney Island of the Mind, and we'll just start at the beginning. So he talks about Ngoya's greatest scenes. Ngoya was a painter who painted images of the suffering humanity of his time. And what Ferlinghetti's going to say is that in the middle of the page, it is as if they really still existed, and they do, only the landscape has changed. Now the people who are suffering, according to Ferlinghetti, are the bottom sections here. The same people, only further from home. Freeways 50 lanes wide on a concrete continent, spaced with bland billboards illustrating imbecile illusions of happiness. Strung out citizens in painted cars with engines that devour America. So what's he talking about here? What is he criticizing about the square 1950s? What's wrong with it from his perspective? Why are they suffering? What?
Consumerism.
Wait, this didn't hear you.
The rampant consumerism.
Okay, yeah, consumerism. And he'll have other poems that get at that as well. But the cars are one symbol of that consumerism, one of the main symbols of post-World War II American consumerism. But the billboards and their advertisements and all those things that people are focusing themselves on. Right? What else can you say about how he depicts the problems with
almost monotony of cement, the 5 lanes or whatever, the cement monotony of life. Something along the lines of that.
Yeah, and we'll see him use other terms, but cement, plastic, neon, all these kind of fabricated elements that the landscape, the houses, the world is becoming, turned into chemicals, right, and prefabricated materials. There's nothing natural left. Let's look at the next one, number 2. At the bottom of 11, this is about sailing through the straits of demos, or of democracy, I guess. And he talks about passing the elephants in bathtubs and the dying donkeys on high hills. He's sort of saying both the Republicans and the Democrats have sort of lost their way. And the helicopters flew over us, dropping free railway tickets from Los Angeles to heaven and promising free elections. So what do you think he's getting at with those phrases? What's he saying about the political parties? I mean, there's kind of a suggestion of sort of false promises. You know, the politicians promise freedom and elections and democracy and progress, but that they don't come through on it. And how about the description of Los Angeles? At this time, in the 1950s, Los Angeles was taken to be, you know, the epitome of America, the best possible place to live. You had Disneyland, you had well, you almost had the Beach Boys, but you were going to have the Beach Boys soon. It was going to be this fun in the sun sort of holiday place. Why might he be calling it Los Angeles?
Because of what you just said, it's going to be a holiday place, it's going to be fake, it's going to be consumerism.
Okay.
That kind of stuff.
And maybe the term we can, to give a new term, would be the American dream. If Los Angeles was the place where the American dream was going to happen, he sees that as a dead end, a non-possibility. You might think of, if you've ever seen The Graduate, at the beginning of The Graduate, the plane begins its descent into Los Angeles, and everybody on the plane just looks monotonous and like they have meaningless lives. And I think that the film is suggesting that Los Angeles, instead of being this mecca for hope and rejuvenation, is actually, you know, a plastic, false place. Let's look at one more image here on page 13, the middle of the page, with its ghost towns and empty Ellis Islands, and its surreal landscape of mindless prairies, supermarket suburbs, steam-heated cemeteries, Cinerama holy days, and protesting cathedrals, a kiss-proof world of plastic toilet seats, Tampax, and taxis. Okay, so he packs a whole lot in there, but what are some of the things he's criticizing with those images? Here at the end he says the immigrant stream has come true and mislaid among the sunbathers. So again he's saying this American dream, it's become too true, it's become a fake plastic version in Los Angeles, and it's, you know, left among the sunbathers. But what are some of the images he has in there? Supermarkets, the consumerism, right? He's definitely criticizing that. What else might he be criticizing?
When he says kiss-proof economy to the detachment, or kind of that move towards the plastic society where you need feeling good.
Yeah, it's a cement, plastic, fake world that you can't kiss it. It's not natural, it's not real, it's not biological anymore. Right? Yeah, definitely. I think that's what he's getting at there. People have prosperity and consumer goods, but they're losing their emotions, they're losing their humanity. See if there's two more things we can find in there. Certainly suburbs is related to the American dream. That's one way of thinking about the American dream, is that suburban home with your refrigerator and your car, your television set. But what's one new one maybe that he brings up here?
The protesting cathedrals, maybe a religious aspect. So, I don't know if that's religion kind of going against mainstream ideology, or if that's society kind of going away from churches and something like that.
But he's certainly talking about religion. And in the line right before that, he talks about Cinerama holy days, right? Is religion becoming processed and packaged? Some kind of, I don't know, for him it's a kind of conservatism in religion. Okay, but he's criticizing a religion. He's not so much against religion as he is against religion when it comes prepackaged on a TV version. He's against televangelists more than he is against. What he might even be saying there is that the cathedrals are protesting, that actual religion doesn't like being turned into a Cinerama television show. Okay. All right. So these are many of the values that he criticizes. Let's look a little further ahead on page 17, number 6. They're putting up a statue of St. Francis where no birds sang. They're hoisting up this statue, and there's reporters and priests. But at the bottom of 17, he says, St. Francis with his arms outstretched to the birds which weren't there. St. Francis is noted for being a priest that ministered to the animals, even, but he's had respect for all the creatures of God's creation, including animals. So there's no bird there, but then on page 18, a very tall and purely naked young virgin with long, very straight straw hair and a very small bird's nest in a very existential place kept passing through the crowds. So what's the alternative value he's presenting us? If he's saying, I'm not so interested in religion, I see it as an empty gesture, or even St. Francis is gesturing to a world with no birds, what's he talking about instead? What should we have more of in this square, conservative, plastic world? All right, I'll give you a hint. Sex is the basic point here. That they believed in more open, freer sexuality. If you've seen the movie version of Jack Kerouac's On the Road or read the book, you know that one of the things that the Beat poets, the Beat generation writers, who these two writers are a part of, was a kind of exploration of sexuality versus what they would see as prudishness. Okay. Now, many people from the square 50s, who might even reject that they're squares, may think that's a negative label, might see this as defending family values and traditional notions of sexuality and gender. Nothing wrong with seeing it that way, only it's not the way that Ferlinghetti sees it. Okay. So if we jump forward a couple more poems, can't even remember. What's the next page that I assigned? 30. Did I have 35? Yeah? And 39? Those are the next two. 35, the penny candy store beyond the L, where I first fell in love with unreality. Jelly beans glowed, Tootsie Rolls and oh boy gum, and a girl ran in, her breasts were breathless in the little room. So what's he talking about there? Again, there's a reference to sexuality, the beauty of the woman, discovering sort of sexuality at the age of adolescence. But what else is he talking about? Why is the candy store with its Tootsie Rolls and gum and jelly beans important? How's it different from square America?
It's a candy store. It's desire. It's what you want.
Yeah, it's desire. It's pleasure. And the two things are obviously related, sexuality and pleasure, desire. But what he wants us to believe in is a world full of pleasure and fun, not a world full of work and, responsibility and those kinds of things. Okay? So you can see in just these simple poems, they're mostly very simple poems, you can see Ferlinghetti presenting us with a new vision of alternative values that today, talking about candy and pleasure and even sexuality isn't that big a deal. But in the 1950s, this was a real contested terrain that he was throwing himself into. And let's look at page 29. This is poem 24. We squat upon the beach of loves, amid dead crabs' claws and starfish prints. We squat among the beach of loves, among the beached mermaids, with their bawling babies and bald husbands. We squat upon the brink of love. Okay? What's he saying there? Again, he's promoting love, desire, but what might he be adding? Especially, let's look at just about 10 lines up from the end. And still we laugh, and still we run, and still we throw ourselves upon love's boats. What's he trying to suggest there? Especially when you contrast it with the bawling babies and the balding men. What's he maybe talking about? Again, maybe responsibility. Just throwing yourself into the world of love and not worrying about growing old, not worrying about children and parenting. There's a kind of what the square 50s would have called irresponsibility, right? That the Beats said we're freeing ourselves from responsibility. The square world would have said you're just being irresponsible. But that's they're different perspectives. Let's go to LIT110 in the Kaufman poems. Again, you're going to notice that Kaufman is highly influenced by modernist artists and especially painters. As he goes through this list, bird with painted wings, the bird is usually a reference to Charlie Parker. That was his nickname, and that's who is kind of the primary muse of Bob Kaufman. But he describes Monet, Picasso, Braque, Mondrian, all these people are influencing him. Modigliani in the middle, naked, exposed sadness, right? So what he's talking about is his literary and artistic influences. From these different artists, he learned different values, he learned different perspectives. Why might it be important that he learned naked, exposed sadness? How does that present a different value to the 1950s perspective?
Because it's an intense emotion, as opposed to the unfeeling plastics we talked about in the square movements.
And you can see how this list and this list are kind of, sometimes just different versions of each other. They're all interrelated things. But the Beats really wanted to live life intensely. What's the opposite of intense emotion? What was the value of the square world? What are you supposed to be if you... if you want to call it negative, you call it repressed, right? But what else? What's another synonym we might use?
Well, there was a poem about the couple, and they were both depressed, or she was having depression underneath the tree where they took their nap or something.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Depressed and depressing, they're not words that the Beats would not say are about Square America. But another word we might use is sober or sobriety. That in 1950s America, you were supposed to be sober. You were supposed to play within the rules, keep your emotions in check. Whereas the Beats, you know, even wanted a kind of sense of wildness, wild emotions. And they didn't care whether it was painful or love. They just wanted to be alive. As you notice there, he's saying expose sadness. One of the Beat critiques of the square world would be that it was all about illusions of happiness, keeping up a facade that you were happy, but not really being able to deal with your emotions, either happy or sad. Okay. And look at the bottom 110. Rousseau shouted poetry from his window on that mad world. A burning bird whistled on high, eat it all, die. Okay, so what again is the Beat value that's being advocated there? I mean, again, intense emotion. What else might you see? What's he shouting? Poetry? So art? In the 1950s, it wasn't cool. Your parents didn't want you to grow up and become an artist, right? But the Beats saw art as the center of life. That they sort of believed everyone should be an artist, and didn't really matter whether you had talent or whatnot. You should write or paint or do something artistic to enhance your life. So the final thing we're going to look at is page 94 and 95. It's all about people listening to secret jazz. About 2/3 of the way down, it's just jazz blowing its top again. We rushed and laughed, pushed and grabbed while jazz blew in the night. So again, that's presenting all those things that we're talking about. Intense emotions, being alive. And jazz, for both Ferlinghetti and Kaufman and many of the Beat writers, was sort of the supreme form of art. What painting was to modernism, jazz was to late modernism. Okay? But it says, suddenly they were too busy to hear the sound. They were busy shoving mud in men's mouth, busy dying on the living ground, busy earning medals for killing children on deserted street corners, occupying their fathers, raping their mothers, busy humans, burning Japanese in atomic color cinemascope with stereophonic screams. Right? So what's the value that he's putting forward there in the context of post-World War II America? What's being debated? Why is he so harsh and use such strong imagery? What is he arguing for and against? Was he arguing for war or against war? Against war, right? I mean, he wouldn't put it in those terms. So he's arguing for a kind of pacifism. And that's important because this is at the height of the Cold War and its patriotic militarism, right? So everyone should say, okay, none of us are in favor of burning Japanese in atomic color cinemascope with stereophonic screens, but what you forget is that and not that anyone was for that during the Cold War or World War II as well. I mean, it wasn't that simplistic. But what he's saying is he's taking a pacifist position in a world that's highly militarized, and there's a lot of patriotism behind that militarism. That people felt like it was their patriotic duty to defend the country militarily. And what Kaufman is trying to do is show them the result of that. That's what this really means, is brutality and pain and death. It's kind of the dark side of patriotic militarism. Okay? Any questions then just about this basic idea of the squares and the other 50s? Because that's the fundamental framework we're going to work from. You're going to see more references in all the text to these kinds of contrasting value systems. And we'll go on to talk about more things, but that's kind of the base level, the groundwork at which the contrast begins. So, what we're going to talk about for a moment is rock and roll music. But we're going to talk later about jazz, which might even be more important for the beat writers. Though I think for all of you, it's a little easier to talk about rock music for a minute and the role that it played in the 1950s. And then when we get to jazz, you're probably less familiar with that, but you'll kind of see where we're going, because both musics functioned in a different sort of way. They disrupted the square American culture, and they promoted alternative values, roughly aligned with the beats, more or less. And so we want to look at a little bit how they did that.
You shake my nerves and you rattle my brain. Too much love drives a man insane. You broke my will, but what a thrill. Goodness gracious, great balls of fire. I let you love all I thought it was mine. You came along and you were me, honey. I changed my mind, this love is mine. Great balls of fire.
Okay, so when we're talking about Jerry Lee Lewis, and maybe especially that song, Great Balls of Fire, what are some of the beat values that it embodies that we just talked about? Is it sober? No, it's about intense emotion, wild freedom of expression, not about sort of following the rules. What else might we say? It's about desire, right? Maybe even about sexuality, probably. I mean, it's hard to see it's not. But the emotion-filled intensity, the desire, the pleasurable lifestyle, as opposed to working, those are all a part of rock and roll music. Even the defiance, you could also say, breaking the rules rather than following the rules. Okay? But when we normally think about the 1950s, we think about the square 1950s. This is Leave It to Beaver, I think. But at any rate, all the 50s sitcoms, that's where we get our images of the square 1950s. Many of you have probably never actually seen one. But they're almost hysterically funny in how stilted they are. That the mother can't do anything until the father gives approval, and the son. It's like the Simpsons episode we looked at, where the father teaches good values to his son so he can't get the baseball mitt or whatever. It's very much that kind of image, and that was how the 50s saw themselves, whether that was reality or not. Always the traditional family sitting around the dinner table, instilling good values into their children. It was all about family values. But the point that we're going to look at in this course is that in the 1950s, there were pesky upstart practices, and there was an oppositional culture. So we can call this the other 50s, or we can call it the seeds of the 1960s, where that oppositional culture will become, if not the dominant culture, at least a part of the mainstream culture. And what we're looking at is then how poets like Ferlinghetti tried to challenge those values and replace them with an alternative set of beat values. Okay? So this is the picture from Goya. This is a picture from Goya. So Ferlinghetti says that the people in the suburbs of America are suffering, that's what he thinks they're suffering like. Not just that they're a little bit discontent or unhappy, but they're sort of in pain and misery. Okay? So the 50s were alive with a vital art, and there was a high proportion of embattled and daring works that presented oppositional ideas. Okay? And that's the basic starting point we want to look at in this tension, in this debate between the 50s and the 60s, or between the 50s and the other 50s. There was another 50s, let's just say. Okay, so two of the things that the rebels of the 1950s are rebelling against are an industrial consumer society. Okay? So that has to do with the plastic cement world of the products of industry. It has to do with mass production of Campbell soup cans and suburban tract homes. And all of that sort of American dream that got tied up in consumerism is what rock and roll rebels, beat rebels, eventually the counterculture of the 1960s, the hippies, would all rebel against that consumerism. And the second thing is a repressive mass society. And what we mean by that is television and radio that only presented one view of things. The mass society, that there were, you could buy the green dishwasher or the red dishwasher, but you didn't have an option not to buy something. The ways in which mass products and mass communications started to create a repressive, conformist kind of culture. So this is just a line, there's going to be two quotes from J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye, where he says, I don't want to be a lawyer, all you do is make a lot of dough and play golf and play bridge and buy cars and drink martinis and look like a hotshot, but how would you not know you're a phony? You wouldn't know. You would be a phony. It's all about that world of consumption in the 1950s that, went from cars to martinis to playing golf. He says most of them would probably marry dopey guys who only cared about their goddamn cars or whether you could beat them at golf, guys that never read books, guys who were really boring. Okay? So again, see how Holden Caulfield throws art into the mix, right? If you don't like books, that's another sign that you're part of Square America. Whether you're a jazz musician or you read books or whatever, art should be a part of a fulfilling life from the beat perspective. So the suburb became a mode of building the affluence and strength of America's Fordist order. It was kind of the central backbone of consumerism and the American dream. It's where all those values of Square America sort of came together. And this Malvina Reynolds song, Little Boxes, is a great example.
Little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes on the hillside, little boxes all the same. There's a pink one and a green one and a blue one and a yellow one, and they're all made out of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same. And the people in the houses all went to the university where they were put in boxes and they came out all the same. And there's doctors and lawyers and business executives and they're all made out of ticky-tacky and they all look just the same.
That's real. It's in Mexico, but it's real.
And they all play on the golf course and drink their martinis dry, and they all have pretty children, and the children go to school, and the children.
Okay. So the point I want to make about that song, not just does it criticize suburbia and make fun of it, which, fair enough, nothing different than what Lawrence Ferlinghetti's doing. But it actually makes a pretty compelling argument about how suburbia is the cornerstone of post-World War II American ideology. Because it says that the houses all look the same, but the people in the houses are the same too. And it's talking about the conformity that spreads from suburbia to the people who live in that world. And then they go to the university, which becomes just another side of conformity. You might think about how much you're paying to be stuck in a little box here. But the doctors and lawyers and business executives, all the jobs, and they play golf and drink their martinis, and then they marry and raise a family, and they repeat that cycle, right? So it's about a whole way of life that extends from the house's architecture itself to the people who live in them, the houses. Okay, now here's where I want you to understand the importance of rock and roll music. Okay? To understand rock and roll music, which you can't really understand because you've lived, it's like the air you breathe, you're so accustomed to it. You have to step back and listen to what people listened to before rock and roll music came along. So here's W.T. Lamone's going to say that popular culture offered little more than silliness before rock music.
How much is that dog in the window? The one with the waggly tail. How much is that dog in the window? I do hope that doggy is for sale.
All right. So what do we notice about that song? Not only is it kind of dated, but what's it about? Buying a doggy in the window, right? It's about consumerism, okay? And it's that song was popular just 1 or 2 years before rock and roll music came on the scene, and then you have to think about the difference, how profound a shift it was, the invention of rock and roll music. And I tried to find it, but I couldn't get it. The scene in Back to the Future, where whatever his name is, Matthew J. Fox, is it? Plays Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good, and everyone's like, I can't believe this music. That's what it was like. I mean, today, sure, there's a few songs that shock here and there, but for the most part, the initial shock of rock and roll music came largely in that first moment. So what cultural values does it promote? Consumerism. What else would you say about values in that song? A kind of passivity, just standing and looking at things. It's aesthetic style. I don't even know what words you would use other than just completely outdated. But do you like it? Is there anyone who likes that song? I mean, it's got a kind of novelty song effect to it, but it's hard to imagine that as the basis for music that people listen to today. How I put it, would you listen to it? Do you have it on your iPod? Nobody has that song, or any song really like it practically, on their iPods today. Okay? What has changed to make such music largely irrelevant today? What really is that change about? But let's look at, here's just 2 years later. And these are songs you probably heard, that may not be heard. Well, we heard that at the beginning. But so you can see the birth of rock and roll was a profound change in American culture, and it embodied these deep values of intense feelings and emotions rather than the sobriety. I mean, you could call that previous song sober, right? It's not advocating anything. It's not powering your emotions. It's just sort of a cute little number. So rock and roll challenged the fundamental ideological consensus of Square America, rejecting its work ethic, its consumerism, its schools, its golf courses, its family structures. Everything that Malvina Reynolds makes fun of in little boxes, rock and roll music makes fun of too. So this is just a simple song, Chuck Berry's Too Much Monkey Business. Running to and fro, hard working at the mill, that's too much monkey business for me. Salesman talking to me, trying to get me to buy something. There's a blonde girl with good looks trying to get me hooked. Wants me to marry, get a home, settle down, write a book. But the punchline to this song is, every time he says, that's too much monkey business for me to be involved in. So he's rejecting all those values that Malvina Reynolds makes fun of too. So the second thing it did was criticize the tenets of Fordist capitalism from the perspective of consumer economy of leisure and pleasure. It made the rebel critique of Spare America fun. So rock and roll music was about fun. It was about sex, drugs, and rock and roll, at least later. At first it was just about fun and driving around in your car with your girlfriend. It criticized Square America, and it criticized the economy, promoting an economy of leisure and fun rather than of work and hard work ethics. So you don't think about this song, but it's one of the first
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock,
rock songs.
5, 6, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, rock. 9, 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock, rock. We're going to rock around 10 o'clock tonight.
Okay? What about that phrase, rocking around the clock? What does that really mean? It's taking the clock of the workday and turning it, instead of a work clock that you have to punch the clock, turning it into fun. We're going to go have fun. We're going to dance. We're going to listen to rock and roll music. We're going to reinvent our world based on pleasure and fun rather than on work. Lots of school songs against school, Pink Floyd's The Wall, Alice Cooper's School's Out Forever, a lot of making fun of school and other institutions. And the last thing we'll end on then is it reflected and it intensified the emergence of a distinct rebel youth culture. That it gave the music, it gave the grammar, the language for rebel culture to develop in, or at least a rebel culture that rebelled against the square 1950s. I mean, I'm not saying they had to be anarchists, but people who didn't want to just settle down and have a family and punch the clock 9 to 5 and buy the latest refrigerator. Okay? So that's where we'll leave off.